It's October, and growing up in an age of mass commercialism, I thought, why not rekindle a time when scary things somehow became tied to a month in the fall? Honestly, I still don't fully understand it, but when you get to the core of most things, not much of it makes sense anyway. But now, in my mid-30s, I've learned that sometimes it's easier to just let go of trying to make sense of everything. My Halloween wasn't some dark, ritualistic affair like some want to claim the holiday is all about. I dressed up as a Ninja Turtle because I liked Ninja Turtles and I wanted candy. Later on, it was just an excuse to stay up all night long watching horror movies as a teenager. Now, I've embraced the nostalgia despite the environmental impact of all the molded plastic we threw around back then. But instead of buying another cheap, mass-produced costume, I'll pop a time-worn disc into my equally decrepit PlayStation 1. I'm sure I'll find something horror-based to play on the channel there, right? Well, I suppose the answer to that is obviously yes. However, the real challenge lies in finding a horror game on the PlayStation 1 that includes mechs. Sure, the console has no shortage of games set in dark, shadowy corridors, all wrapped in that signature blackness. In fact, there are plenty of titles that weren't even intended to be frightening, but end up being so simply because of that unsettling, creeping void the PlayStation 1 seems to conjure effortlessly. Even during its prime, there was something eerie about those warbly graphics, the occasional silence, and, as I've probably mentioned way too much already, that notorious PS1 void. It's strange how that particular visual distortion and emptiness could make even the most harmless game feel just a little off. Now, I'm sure some of you are already thinking of titles like Kalik and its sequel, Epidemic, but honestly, I completely forgot about those after a rather half-hearted review of the first game in the early days of this channel. Well, seeing as I'm only now hitting about 3k subs, maybe these days are still the early days. So, comment, like, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Let's finally push this channel into that long-awaited middle era. As for those games I mentioned, I'll definitely revisit them soon, especially Epidemic and its semi-sequel reboot, Brahma Force. After all, those do deserve a proper look, don't they? Anyhow, my first discovery during this pursuit had me recalling a peculiar title by the name of Space Griffon VF-9. It's a game that's been on my mind longer than I'd probably like to admit, dating all the way back to my rather flawed Gun Griffon retrospective. Likely because it shares the word Griffin in the title, a few people jumped to the assumption that it was somehow connected to the Gun Griffon franchise, but aside from featuring mechs, it has virtually nothing to do with those games. Space Griffon was developed by Panther Software and published by the legendary Atlus, though no, that doesn't mean it's an Atlus game, they simply handled its release. The game is actually a reimagining of the Japanese-only PC-98 title Hamlet, followed by another remake on the Dreamcast. Unfortunately, neither of these versions made it overseas, nor did they get fan translations. There has been some chatter online, with a few folks proclaiming that Hamlet is one of the first true survival horror games, predating the official use of the genre label. While that's an intriguing claim, I'm skeptical about its legitimacy, especially since both Alone in the Dark and Sweet Home existed long before. Maybe Hamlet arrived before the term survival horror was coined, but it certainly wasn't the first game to embody those elements. That said, Hamlet does share an eerie System Shock vibe, with its limitations heightening a sense of fear and isolation within a vast unknown space. On the Dreamcast, the developers leaned more towards the anime and action stylings, even revamping the original cutscenes into action-packed animations. You're still navigating dark corridors, but the focus shifted more towards action. The PlayStation version, however, retains more of Hamlet's original atmosphere. Honestly, I find the name Hamlet far more fitting than Space Griffon VF-9. The original title evokes a sense of mystery and intrigue, hinting at the setting, a vast megastructure on the moon called Hamlet. Space Griffon VF-9, on the other hand, makes it sound like the game is all about intense combat, reinforced by its very misleading cover art. In reality, though, it's not even that type of game at all, something I'll dive into soon. Now, for those familiar with Harmony Gold and Studio Nua's notoriously defensive business practices, you might be surprised that this game openly refers to its mechs as VFs. That's dangerously close to Macross and Robotech's variable fighters, and the title even includes VF-9. What's more, just like Macross, the mechs in this game transform into 3 separate forms. You think this would have sparked a lawsuit, especially with Harmony Gold's history of aggressively pursuing Battletech, but maybe they were too busy at the time to notice the blatant similarities. Though how that happened with 3 versions across 3 systems is beyond me. As you can probably tell from what I've been saying, Space Griffon really comes across as a solid sci-fi horror title, perfect for my half-hearted attempt at a Halloween-themed video series. There's even an eerie lack of music, leaving you alone with the sounds of your VF and the enemies lurking around the corners of Hamlet's shadowy corridors. Or at least, that's the intention. Though, I'll admit, the constant shuffling sounds while moving can get a little annoying. Personally, I really wanted to like the game, and I sort of do. I've got a soft spot for unconventional titles from the Wild West days of the Saturn and PlayStation eras. Maybe I'm a little too soft on them, to be honest. You just don't see games like Space Griffon anymore, mostly because the industry has moved away from passion-driven projects and embraced the era of massive corporate budget crunchers. It's not that games today lack identity, but titles like Space Griffon went deeper in some key areas. They weren't just about visuals or storytelling, they integrated everything right down to the feel of the controls. And here's sort of where Space Griffon inadvertently shines. The controls themselves are a key part of the experience. There are heavy simulation elements at play despite the limitations of the original PlayStation controller. Combat and maneuvering are clunky, but in a way that adds to the immersion. Once you get used to how your VF handles, it starts to feel more natural. The challenge of mastering the controls pulls you deeper into the setting because you're not just playing the game, you're learning it. And honestly, I think that's something that is missing from a lot of modern games. Today, you can pick up a new title and chances are you can just jump right in thanks to control schemes borrowed from games over the last 15 years or so. There's also a light RPG system at work here, adding a bit of flavor to an otherwise basic stat progression. But honestly, you're not going to be severely disadvantaged by anything other than the game's learning curve. There's plenty of leeway when it comes to combat. Your VF can absorb loads of damage before you even need to think about using repair items. As the game progresses, you'll find a decent selection of weapons, though most are just upgraded versions of your starting loadout. There's also a shield, which was pretty unique for its time. It can absorb damage and be repaired, but since you have to switch to it and can't fire while using it, it often feels more practical to just sidestep enemies and take them down with something else. Now, I'm not going to pretend there's any real depth or nuance to the combat, because there absolutely isn't. Space Griffon's battles are simple, aim and fire, and that's pretty much it. And well, that's because when you really get down to it, this game isn't about combat, or even really about using your VF. Yes, in truth, Space Griffon VF-9 is more of an adventure game than anything else. Thankfully, without any of that infamous moon logic you sometimes find in older titles. Most of your time is spent exploring empty corridors, searching for items to help you progress. The puzzles are pretty straightforward, typically involving item retrieval or finding a passcode. Occasionally, you'll have to clear an area of enemies, but that's about the extent of the combat's role in progression. For the vast majority of the game, you're moving from point A to point B within the Hamlet megastructure, interacting with various characters along the way. In fact, there is so much dialogue in this game that it's almost a borderline visual novel, if not for the fact that none of the character communications are actually subtitled. You can't go 2 minutes without being contacted by one of the AMAX cleaners, who have a tendency to ramble about nearly everything, sometimes in agonizing detail. There's even a bizarre monologue about a baseball game that drags on for far longer than it should.
It was 10-9 with the Blue Wings winning it in the 11th inning. The decisive hit was a come-from-behind home run by Michael Labat.
If you knew that, why didn't you figure out the code?
Oddly though, you often hear more about what other characters are doing than what you're actually doing yourself. At times, I did find some of this interesting. Hearing about what was happening in other parts of the station while Jim, the player character, is off cleaning wayward security robots. The cast is fairly well-rounded, and you spend a surprising amount of time getting to know all of them, mainly because they just don't seem to stop talking while they're alive. Honestly, I personally believe that Space Griffon VF-9 might be one of the most heavily voice-acted games on the PlayStation ever. It can be a bit much, especially when Jim, callsign Kid, has an opinion on just about everything. He narrates almost every single action in exhausting detail.
These are plastic explosives. There are 8 of them in all. They're the surface attachment type, but could they be used against enemies? I don't need them.
Why are you the way that you are?
If you try to go somewhere off limits, the game grinds to a halt as he delivers a monologue explaining why.
Hey, this is where Rousing is supposed to be. I'd better get back to my territory and go after point 2, or Oreg will be yelling at me.
If he can't use an item yet or isn't supposed to pick something up, you get the same spiel. He'll even go into vast specifics about the elevator system, only to conclude with something like, "I don't need to do that yet." Combine this with the constant chatter from other characters, and the pacing starts to feel painfully slow. And then there's the voice acting itself, which, depending on your tastes, may be questionable.
I'm all set. Now I'm ready for some action. Boss, this is Stormy. Sorry for worrying you. I'm back in action, thanks to Kid. What should we do now?
This is Boss. All levels haven't been purged yet. You and Kid purge that area. If you don't hurry, something really bad might happen. I'm counting on you. Over.
Space Griffon has the kind of low-budget anime voice work that was all too common in the 80s and 90s. Personally, I stick to Japanese dubs nowadays, but if you're familiar with that older style, you might recognize it here, for better or worse. One thing I did appreciate though was that the female character Stormy wasn't reduced to the typical meek or overly cutesy female character. She's actually one of the most expressive characters in the game.
Everyone was telling me that you're a destroyer, and I thought that you only broke things. Ow!
I do my own maintenance. Don't take me for a chump. Stop your blabbering and go find my Tesla manager.
Unfortunately, the rest of the cast follows more predictable tropes. The Joker, the gruff guy, the smart one, and the ever-serious straight man. And Jim, well, let's say he might just be the most G-rated protagonist in Sci-Fi. His strongest reactions are, oh darn, shoot, heck, and gosh, which makes him feel more like a character out of a family-friendly show than someone who specializes in the extermination of intercompany threats.
Darn! Blocked off at the rear.
Now, Space Griffon's story is rather cut and dry, but it does shine when its horror elements sometimes wade into the forefront. The concept of a virus mutating everything it comes in contact with is a familiar one, but it's a trope I personally enjoy, especially when it starts to enter the realm of body horror. Though I do have to ask, why is there always that one grotesque creature that ends up resembling, well, lady parts? Actually, on second thought, maybe I don't need that explained to me after all. To be honest, it's pretty clear that the developers over at Panther Software had a real love for aliens and The Thing. Space Griffon borrows heavily from The Thing's themes of paranoia, isolation, and unseen threats that insidiously infect their hosts. In many ways, the game feels like a long-winded mech-themed version of The Thing, but set in a moon-based megastructure. And as for aliens, well, that influence is really easy to spot too. You've got a cold, uncaring corporation lurking in the background, covering up unethical experiments, and a mysterious, seemingly unstoppable lifeform stalking Kid as he makes his way through silent, shadowy corridors. It's all familiar territory. The only real, original element here seems to be the concept of lunar tears. These stones amplify the effects of the virus spreading throughout Hamlet, with the nature being that they're highly sought after on Earth, having become a widespread trend. This is an intriguing twist, one that actually kind of feels fresh. It adds a layer of social commentary, subtly linking the spread of the virus to consumer trends back home, adding to the typical sci-fi horror plot. I do have to give them credit for that little bit of originality. Yet, despite being a flawed game, there's still something I genuinely like about Space Griffon VF-9. A lot of it has to do with how well it uses the PlayStation's hardware limitations to its advantage. It feels like the developers carefully examined every shortcoming of the system and decided to work around them with surprising effectiveness. The visuals may be simple, but they're purposeful. Enemy designs are kept straightforward, with the bigger, more impressive ones saved for later stages. Though, to be honest, the boss fights themselves are often a letdown. Most of them just involve circling a stationary, oversized enemy while avoiding its attacks. There's not much complexity there at all. That said, as you progress, you're rewarded with more intricate and cooler enemy designs, which is a nice touch. The game gives you something to look forward to visually, especially with the team's VF mechs. Each one stands out with a unique design, making it easy to get attached to certain characters based on their mech's look. I always appreciated that sort of touch, and it adds personality to the squad. However, I've got to mention Stormy's VF, which does feel like a bit of a misfire. There's a lot you could say, but probably shouldn't when a mech is unnecessarily designed with exaggerated feminine features like breasts and higher hips. It just feels out of place and like a missed opportunity to design something more cohesive with the rest of the game's aesthetic. I do gotta throw some points out there for the character portraits and cutscenes as well, which are really well animated. They have that signature hand-drawn pixel style you'd expect from something on the PC-98, and for all I know, they might have just been ripped straight from Hamlet. Either way, they're surprisingly appealing and still hold up pretty well, even after 29 years. So looking at the cover, did you think that Space Griffon VF-9 was going to be an action-packed romp with a knockoff variable fighter? Honestly, if you had picked this up back in the day, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that. Most people in North America in 1995 probably didn't even know what a PC-98 was, let alone have any clue about a game called Hamlet. So it's doubtful they would have thought otherwise. Space Griffon is definitely not perfect across the board, but there's something oddly engaging here if you're willing to deal with the learning curve that comes with the controls. And in my opinion, it easily beats out games like Kalik, even if that one did have some interesting designs going for it. So if you're in the mood to wander around spooky corridors in a game with no music and just a constant barrage of side character chatter, I'd say give Space Griffon a go. Just don't expect a full-blown action experience, because it just definitely is not that.